When people think of the Trojan War, they imagine Achilles, Hector, and a wooden horse. But historians ask a different question. Did a real war happen at Troy, or are we only chasing poetry? So today, we're going to separate myth from evidence using archaeology, ancient texts, and modern scholarship to explain what the Trojan War likely was and what it was not. Okay? So let's talk about the Trojan War in ancient tradition and what that really means to us. So our primary sources of the Trojan War come from epic poetry, not history books, not letters, not lists or anything really practical. The most famous is Homer's Iliad. I actually just bought my son a copy of this. Traditionally dated to the 8th century BCE, importantly, the Iliad does not tell the story of the war from beginning to end. It focuses on just a few weeks near the end of a 10-year conflict. So other ancient works such as the Odyssey, later Greek tragedies, and Roman authors like Virgil expanded the story over centuries. Modern scholars agree on one thing though. So these texts are literary tradition, shaped by oral storytelling and not eyewitness history. It's like a lot of the ancient Roman things that we don't have the primary sources anymore. So, but what does that mean? Because it doesn't mean that they just were made up and came from nowhere. So let's talk about the archaeological site of Troy. Okay, so in the 19th century, the idea of a historical Troy gained credibility when excavations began in Hisarlik in modern northwestern Turkey. So archaeologists have identified multiple layers of settlement, but one on top of another, spanning thousands of years. So these are people who stayed in place and built up over time. So two layers are specifically important here. Okay, so Troy 6, which was about 1700 to 1250 BCE, and Troy 7a, 1250 to 1180 BCE. Troy 6 was a wealthy, fortified city with massive stone walls, exactly the kind of place that's described in ancient tradition. However, it appears to have been damaged primarily by an earthquake, not warfare. Now, Troy 7a, on the other hand, it shows scarring, it shows signs of fire, it shows rapid rebuilding and rapid repairs. You know, things that we can kind of see and are familiar with sieges of the time. Storage jars were buried inside houses, suggesting siege conditions, right? The common folk tend to try to hide their wealth so that if the city does fall, the enemy doesn't get their hands. Many scholars also believe that Troy 7a is the best archaeological candidate for a real conflict remembered later on as the Trojan War. So the Bronze Age world behind the myth, because of the epics, because of Homer, because of these poets, the Bronze Age is kind of romanticized a lot. And if conflict occurred, it would have taken place during the late Bronze Age, around 1200 BCE. This was a time of very powerful kingdoms, right? So you have the Mycenaeans, you have the Hittites. So the Hittites were an empire in Anatolia, and actually there was a big battle of Kadesh between the Hittites and Egypt. And then, of course, you have Egypt in the eastern Mediterranean and their power that came from the Nile. So Troy sat at this strategic trade choke point, controlling access between the Aegean Sea and the Black Sea. And that alone not only made it valuable and the occupants very wealthy, but dangerous. Right? So Hittite diplomatic records mention a city called Wilusa, which many scholars identify linguistically with Ilios, the Greek name for Troy. These texts also refer to disputes involving Western warlords. So this is where the Mycenaeans might come in. This does not prove Homer's story, but it does confirm Troy existed and was involved in regional power struggles. So let's ask the question, was there a 10-year war? Probably not in the way that the epics describe. Modern historians overwhelmingly reject the idea. So modern historians overwhelmingly reject the idea of a single 10-year siege, a unified Greek army, And specifically, let's talk about Helen of Troy, right? And also heroic duels as literal history. Was there a real Hector? Was there a real Achilles? Did they face each other in this battle? So instead, the Trojan War likely reflects a series of conflicts, raids, or a limited war remembered and exaggerated through centuries of oral tradition. Right? Play the game of telephone. By the time you get to 20 people, the story's completely changed. So historian Moses Finley famously argued Homer preserves social memory, not factual reportage. And I really like the phrasing of that. So the war became a foundational myth, a way Greeks explained their past identity and values. So if there wasn't a 10-year war, was there a Trojan horse? Was that real or was this a symbol? And the bad news is there is no archaeological evidence for a literal wooden horse. Most scholars interpret it as a metaphor for deception and subterfuge, a symbolic reference to siege tactics on how to get the best way to win a siege is to just get the gates open and not have to scale the walls. So, or really it could have been someone making something up to make their poem sound better. So, but there's also those that suggest it could reflect a breach caused by treachery. So like I was saying, you pay someone off, you get the gates open, or the guards just don't patrol that section of the wall at night. Or, honestly, an earthquake associated with Poseidon, who was also the god of horses. Or simply a powerful storytelling device. None of these can be proven or refuted, if I'm honest. In short, the horse is mythic, but the conflict itself may not be. So why the Trojan War still matters. The Trojan War sits at the boundary between prehistory and history. And really, like I said, we have stories and poems about it, but what it really represents is how real events become myth, right? How memory outlives facts. Even today in modern American history, we have Johnny Appleseed, Davy Crockett, Daniel Boone, right? How societies explain collapse and violence. That's another way. This may have been a way to communicate the fact that Troy did exist, but was ultimately destroyed. And around 1200 BCE, the Bronze Age world collapsed across the eastern Mediterranean. Cities burned, trade networks ultimately crumbled, and kingdoms fell. The Trojan War may be one remembered fragment of that larger catastrophe. Not history as it happened, but history as it was remembered. So, to tie all this up is, did the Trojan War happen? Yes. Most likely, we have evidence that proves that it did. May not have been 10 years, most likely didn't involve a wooden horse, and it's definitely not exactly as Homer tells it. However, archaeology, texts, and scholarship suggest something real and something violent once occurred at Troy. And from that reality, one of humanity's greatest stories was born. I'm Steve Lenore. This is the Adventure Historian. Hope you enjoyed this video. Have a great new year. Thank you again.